Hello and welcome to this joint ProCon Leicestershire Nottinghamshire webinar. I'm Umesh Desai and I'm the chair of ProCon Leicestershire. ProCon has been connecting professionals in property and construction since 2000 in Leicestershire and 2018 in Nottinghamshire. We now boast a combined membership of more than 1,000 people. We hope that many of our members have joined us today to listen to this webinar. We're always looking for more people to join the network. So if you are not a member and are interested in joining and finding out more, please drop us an email at info@procon-leicestershire.co.uk for Leicestershire and info@procon-nottinghamshire.co.uk for Nottinghamshire, or you can give us a call on 07803 126 807. Today we're taking a look at the new measures to improve building safety standards that were announced by Housing Secretary Robert Jenrick back in January. At the time, they were described as the biggest change in building safety for a generation. We'll be delving into detail and looking at how the Grenfell Tower fire shaped their creation. Paul Meadows from Salus Approved Conspectors will provide an overview of the current regulations and highlight the proposed changes, focusing on fire regulations. Then Canty Chappie from Stephen George and Partners and Step Knowles' Darren Wallace will be giving us their industry insight into how the changes will impact upon current and future planning developments. We'll also be hosting a live question and answer session at the end of the webinar with assistance from Danielle at Cartwright Communications, where Paul, Canty and Darren will answer your questions. We'll also be joined at that point by Peter Brown from Stephen George and Partners as well. If you have a question for any of them, simply type it into the box below and we'll be answering these a little while. You can also use the upvote function if you see a particular question you'd like to know the answer to. So please make use of this, as we'll be able to make sure we answer the question that you're most interested in. It's a jam-packed webinar we've got for you today. So without further ado, let's hear from Paul Meadows.
I think when we had this dreadful fire that happened in June 2017, we probably didn't anticipate the effects it would have upon the construction industry. And from our point as a regulatory provider, it probably changed it forever, really, in terms of that. And as part of that was the changes from the golden thread. The golden thread was something that was produced by Dame Judith, an expectation that whereby there is a clear follow through with regards to how the process is audited from a start to a finish. Now, I think it was probably quite evident that it was wrongly assumed that approved document B would provide clear guidance. I think when we look at the number of buildings now that are being taken apart and having cladding revisited, and it cannot possibly be the guidance was appropriately clear that everybody got it wrong effectively. And part of that guidance was that it assumed that buildings over 18 meters high will contain insulation that was materials of limited combustibility, and external spread of flame would be class 0. What the guidance didn't really do was to specifically prohibit materials that didn't meet that criteria when they were over 18 meters high. And indeed, when we think about it really, in terms of things such as sprinklers, at the time of the fire, then only buildings over 30 meters high actually required the incorporation of sprinklers. So they brought in significant changes as part of the regulatory process. And the first significant one was to incorporate a ban on combustible materials within external walls on certain buildings. These amendments came into force on the 21st of December 2018. So the first significant change was within Regulation 7, And that was to effectively bring in measures for buildings over 18 metres high that contained one or more dwelling, or they included an institutional building or a room for residential purposes, but they specifically excluded a hotel, a hostel, or a boarding house. But it also includes other buildings such as flats, student accommodation, care homes, sheltered housing, hospitals, dormitories, as long as they are over 18 metres high. And as I've said, it's very important that those regulations are brought into force rather than within the guidance that was in approved document B before. Effectively, what that did is it banned all materials within external wall construction so that from the inside to the outside, they're non-combustible. There are a few exceptions to that because not all parts of all construction can be such that they're wholly non-combustible, otherwise we physically could not build buildings. But there are only limited exemptions. Those limited exemptions apply to cavity trays where they're used between two leaves of masonry, where they're part of a roof. The part that doesn't apply where their roof is effectively almost like a wall, where there are doors and frames, if there's electrical installations, if there's insulation and waterproofing materials, where they're used below ground floor level, and indeed where there is intumescent fire stopping materials, so that effectively you can appropriately fire stop a building. It doesn't apply to membranes, it doesn't apply to seals, gaskets, fixings, sealants, or backer rods, and also regards to thermal breaks. It's important to also look at other aspects such as windows and window frames because they're also exempted. But as we move forward and look at some of the areas that were looked at to be reanalyzed, then there's an element of discrepancy within that. Spandrel panels and infill panels have to meet that requirement. So if we have a glazed window with an insulated panel below it, then that does have to meet that requirement. What the government decided to do was, a year after that ban, was to reevaluate the changes. And what it did was to look at whether they were appropriate really for the building itself. And part of that review was to look at whether those exempt parts were actually appropriate for fit for purpose effectively. And looking at that, an example of that might well be something like a laminated glass. A laminated piece of glass is exempt when it's in a window, but where it's not located within a window, such as in a location such as a balcony, in that location, then it isn't exempt. And that's particularly because even though a laminated piece of glass would appear to be very non-combustible, then in reality, it's got properties that actually contain combustible elements. Effectively, there's a piece of plastic between two layers of glass. So that therefore means that in those situations, then laminated glass on a balcony isn't exempt. But other parts of that significant change were to look at whether other parts should be brought back into the exemptions. Now, one of the aspects that I mentioned before was hotels, hostels, boarding houses. Well, they were exempt before, but they're potentially looking at, as part of the consultation, to bring that back within the scope of the ban. There's also an expectation to look at the height of the 11-metre threshold. Well, the 11-metre threshold is becoming quite a key criteria, really. Already, there are changes with regards to sprinklers, which we'll visit in a minute. But other than that, then effectively, it's potentially looking at reducing the height of the combustibility ban right down to 11 metres. There's a proposal to ban likes of ACMs because of that polyethylene core, irrespective of the height, purpose, or the use. And that's quite an important change, that effectively how that's proposed. Also extending the ban to include solar shading, because that was something that was actually missed out of the enactment of the Regulation 7 because they didn't think that was part of the significant change to the way in which a fire would propagate effectively. So that's effectively going to be brought back in, and Regulation 7 will now effectively, if it's included in the effects of the consultation, bring that back in. And as final part of the significant change, number 2, was really look at the change of the listing exemptions with regards to a temporary exemption for the likes of cavity trays, really in the recognition that to form buildings with other than 2-litre masonry, then it isn't so easy to actually exempt it so that it's a non-combustible material. And then the third significant change. The third significant change really is to incorporate some new building regulations that we have that come into effect on the 26th of November this year. Of course, the way that we have with devolved powers, then it only applies to England, whereas Wales will follow through later with their own particular changes. In terms of all building regulations, when they're brought into effect, there is a transitional arrangement, and that transitional arrangement allows for projects that have already been on the drawing board, that are being proposed, to have a time period where they physically have to start by. And what that does really in effect is it brings in a 2-month period from the introduction of the regulation itself. So by the 29th of January 2021, then if a project has not started on site, then it has to effectively apply the new regulations. So that's significant change number 3, the amendments that come into force in November. Then they realistically, what they've done is they've brought that height down from the 30 metre originally, potentially was going to go to 18, and then has brought it down to 11 metres. There's also an expectation that firefighting provisions should be applied so that there are wayfinding signage for the fire authority, so they've got identification where they are within a building when there is a fire in any building with a story height over 11 metres high. There was a change to permitted development rights as part of the government's expectation to try and develop properties. And as part of that, what the government has done is to open up the avenues available to use existing buildings so that they can increase the housing supply. But part of that has to be to ensure that that the fire safety itself is not compromised as part of that. So the permitted development rights, they've incorporated some effects that could have a paramount effect on fire safety by the additional stories to buildings, and they need to consider the height of the building. For example, if it's over 11 metres high, it will need to incorporate sprinklers. If there's external wall construction over 18 metres, and that's currently, that could well reduce down to 11 metres, as we've discussed as part of the amendments and the consultation. The material classification has to be an A1 or an A2 S1D0. The firefighting provisions need to be incorporated. There has to look at aspects such as the internal arrangements to make sure that travel distances are not affected. And the internal fire spread in relation to B3 has to be also considered. And particularly with regards to things such as the change of use, the external wall construction, something that's been paramount to these 3 changes that have happened so far, need to be incorporated to ensure that they meet that criteria.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks for joining this ProCon webinar. I'm Kanti Shapi, Studio Director at Stephen George & Partners, Architects and Master Planners. I'm going to start in a somber fashion with the next image you're going to see, because it's a shocking image. And it's a reminder of the tragedy that we should keep in our minds in all these discussions on these matters. The date, 14th of June 2017, and a reminder of that there were 72 deaths. The many consequences from this tragedy, of course. And here are just some of the consequences which are far-reaching. Some of the recent headlines that I've gathered are just from the last couple of months, as you can see here. And many parties impacted. You can see the discussion in the one window there regarding soaring insurance costs for high-rise flats. The next one covers what are the rules for evacuation for disabled people? It's triggered that discussion as well. The personal impact on building inspectors and the pressures that they're under has been discussed at the Grenfell inquiry. And even the police are under focus. And that last slide, the last image at the bottom there, discussion about costs and value for money has been has arisen, hasn't it? So all these factors have been triggered by that tragedy, and something to bear in mind throughout. The impact on the industry, and in particular consultants, is also far-reaching. Again, a couple of more, 3 more headlines from the Architects Journal this time. And you'll see there how my own profession as architects, we're faced with emerging limitations and restrictions on PI cover, with huge rises in premiums and excess, really significant rises in some cases. I think there was an earlier AJ headline of a practice reporting an 800% rise in their annual premium on PI. It's also impacting building inspectors as well. And there's been a general withdrawal of insurance companies from the construction sector. So the field is very narrowing and very aggressive from that point of view then. I've added the last one in there because it mentions about the striking off of an architect over fire safety lapses. The government response on this, there's a commitment to deliver the biggest change in building safety for a generation. So a big transformation of the building regulations, as it says, in a whole generation period. And the Housing Secretary also announced the future safety bill, which would cover the introduction of a new regulation tier of a building safety regulator. They've come out with clarifications and building safety advice documents for building owners. So there's a proposal to extend the cladding bans, and this is particularly related to high-rise residential buildings in particular. And there's a note on fire sprinklers as well. That information is still going through a consultation on sprinklers, and then we should be hearing some more in February. And then building owners have been going to be taken action against in terms of making their buildings safe. Now, one of the documents that has been released is an interesting one, actually, which is the manual to the building regulations, which this gives a more accessible explanation of the building regs, perhaps to the layperson, not so much the professional. Although, again, I think it's a valid document for us all to have an awareness of and reading. And it does try to explain things in terms of the building regulations, the separate sections, and what they stand for and what the expectations are on them in a succinct document here. This document, which has been produced by the government, is the advice for building owners of multi-story, multi-occupied residential buildings. So again, that's a little more comprehensive in terms of things to look out for by building owners in terms of their attitude on the building regs and forthcoming changes in particular. It's quite a useful set of information, actually. And again, I'd recommend you to seek it out and have a look. It's not just for building owners, I would say. It's also valid for professionals and the whole construction team. The big document is the Building Safety Bill, which is currently going through Parliament. And this draft bill introduces this concept of a building safety regulator. The regulator will have these 3 main functions, which I've listed there: to oversee the safety and standard of all buildings, directly assure the safety of higher rise buildings, and improve the competence of people responsible for managing and overseeing building work. The last one, I think, has some big implications in terms of knowledge and understanding that people bring to projects. So one of the big points is the 3 stages, that there's going to be what they're called a golden thread of vital information. And at each point of these stages, it's a checkpoint, isn't it? You know, that we reflect back, we look forward, and we record what's happening, and particularly with regards to safety and fire safety in particular. So it's very much signaling the need for much greater communication, much greater dialogue between all the parties involved, perhaps more so than we've ever done in the past. And certainly from our point of view, you know, the good recording of that information, so that in the future it can be reflected back on and looked on and checked. And there's some implications for the actual residents and building users there in terms of registration with the safety regulator, and even the building inspectors who will be responsible for signing off the buildings will have to follow these new rules, and they're obliged to register with the regulator as well. And the last sentence there just refers to the fact that the government are introducing new powers to actually manage and control construction materials in buildings as well. In the next slide, I'm going to share with you some recent personal experiences. And you can see there's quite a list there, and not in any particular order, but I'll just pick out some main ones, which is the first one is quite important, I would suggest, in that do check with building owners and occupiers in terms of any specific insurance requirements that could override statutory legislation. So be aware, check, and ask questions. I had an example recently of the use of EPS, or polystyrene insulation, in roof and floor constructions, which we managed to resolve in the end through consultation with the insurance companies. The next 4 relate to existing building, which involved a cladding refurbishment. And it just heightens the level of extra scrutiny that's demanded on information, both proposed information, new interventions on a building, and of course existing building construction as well. A growing level of wariness from subcontractors and suppliers in terms of their design and product liability, I've noted. And then in terms of design approach, sometimes these more stringent fire regulations have to be taken into account with, for example, where there's open plan designs in residential apartment design, for example. I'm going to close now with a summary of looking at the way forward, question mark. I believe it to be, it shouldn't come down to one professional or one consultant. It shouldn't all fall back to, you know, the building inspector or the architect, if I can defend my own profession. The task ahead is a collective responsibility. It requires a team approach. And that's reinforced, if I can remind everyone about the obligations to the Building Safety Regulator, which again I've listed there. And this notion of a golden thread of vital information about the building to be gathered over its lifetime, and everyone contributes to that along each of those stages and throughout, and the dialogue needs to be maintained, and we work in collaboration and mutual support with each other between all the parties involved in all stages of design, construction, and occupation. Thank you.
This image for me is something that you kind of feel runs through my mind all the time, and it's probably something everybody experiences in what we do on a day-to-day basis. And obviously, when something like Grenfell happens, you can quite well imagine the amount of finger pointing and things that's happening, and that blame game obviously starts to happen because everybody gets defensive, but nobody really wants to put their hand up and say, look, we could have done something different. I think as we've been speaking in the last couple of weeks, the changes that are coming about, it's timely, it's definitely needed. It's definitely needed to a point of actually putting a little bit more pressure on some of those things that are really important that come through the design, the delivery, and the handover process. In my mind, value engineering is the bit that everybody's kind of hot on in terms of trying to get to the route to a cheaper product or a better solution or something like that. And you think about the scenarios that we are faced with on a day-to-day basis. You put all that into context with an inquiry and something like the Grenfell situation, and we've got to sit back and look at that and say, surely a little bit more time, a little bit more of a concerted effort around making that decision based on informed facts has got to be far outweigh against the cost incurred in the inquiry, the time, and everybody else that's been affected by it. When you see where those pressures are, in my mind, they're kind of in four areas. Pre-con and opportunities is the first bit, and where everything starts, right the way through to production and supply chain. And then delivery on site, see, that's the pressure pot. That's where, from a point of getting the actual product delivered, that's where a lot of this is occurring. But equally, you've got to look at the employees in the industry and the upskilling that's possibly needed. So when I started to go through some of it, and we were discussing there are points that keep cropping up, and I think the main one at pre-con and at tendering stages and things like that, there's a massive shift at the minute in PI and insurance levels, and actually what's levelled in an ER is very different to what's actually required by building and end users insurance levels there. And we're finding certainly at the moment, and live examples within the last month or so, that in tendering processes, we're having to ask about PI levels to just make sure that actually what we're getting back from consultants, subbies, suppliers is the right level that's needed. I think in a supply chain scenario, and with products and with the consultants and subbies that we work with, I personally feel, I mean, obviously everybody's opinion is also different, but I personally feel as though we are currently in a very expansive market of products. There's lots out there that are offering alternatives and better, quicker ways of doing things, and it feels saturated. I think when it gets to delivery, there's a lot happens on sites. A lot gets broken down now. Lots, and not so much in our own trades. It's in subcontract packages. It's in supply materials only. The thing for me that I think we've constantly got to look at is the audit trail and the workmanship level that's happening. It's all too frequent that at times, resourcing levels on jobs is not quite probably where they need to be. I'm not saying this is wholly, that how things are within Stepnell. This is generalizations that I've seen across working experiences for the last 20 years. But challenges are always different, and sites are always managed in different ways. I kind of feel and understand that. But what you've got to kind of come back to is that net result of, are the resource levels right for the type of project that we're actually dealing with? And then I think from an employee point of view and industry generally, I mean, none of us are experts in everything that we get involved in. But we need to take it upon ourselves to become a little bit more aware of what things else are happening out there. I'm not an M&E expert. I'm certainly not a groundwork expert, but you're exposed to it on a day-to-day basis with projects. A greater level of understanding and a greater level of knowledge around just generally where some of those things fit. Now, I wanted to stick with those same four blocks of what we're doing within Stepnell. The bidding process is so much more selective now. We've got to be very careful about what we get involved in. There's a wider team input into everything that we kind of bid. Is it the right project? Is it the right fit? These words come up on a day-to-day basis. Products and supply chain, I've mentioned it earlier, but I mean, for me, the big one from my perspective, when I arrived at Stepnell, I've presented it at a business plan level. There's still a lot of work to do with it, but we need to get closer to fewer consultants. We need to form a trusted network of supply chain and people that we feel are right for us, that we want to work with. You get far more consistency out of working with somebody that you've worked with time and time again. They get to learn you, we get to learn them. And in project delivery, I mean, the thing for me is it goes back to the tender process as well. It's team input. So we're teamship days. It's a whole team working ethos. It's estimators, it's pre-con, it's design management resource, it's commercial, it's QS, it's project manager, it's contracts manager. Whatever discipline we've got within that project, we want to hand it over and launch it with that full team involved. So these were the guys involved at tender, these were the guys that were involved at negotiation or at handover stage, and now the project's going to get launched on site. This is the story that you're inheriting. And then obviously employee upskilling individually in Stepnell. We've got a framework. We've got a framework of training workshops and wider training development. That happens May, autumn, and seasonal workshops that come in there on hot topics. It's senior management level stuff. It's then cascaded down to mid-management level and to operatives on site. But it's tiered in a way that actually just really engages and gets to a point of saying, well, actually, people are aware. They won't know all the facts, but they're aware that there's something there that, that affects them as well. These are really all just kind of headline feelings, but they're pieces and snippets of the type of thing that we're dealing with on a regular basis, but very much now reinforced off the back of Grenfell, changes in the regulations, and actually what it is we've got to get ourselves involved in and become so much more aware of what else we can affect if we don't take that decision properly. So I mean, really, for me, just to wrap up, I'm going to take a snippet from Kanti's presentation, because I think it hits the nail on the head, and it's as much really to say that that way forward we kind of align to this thing of a golden thread, but we've all got a duty to harness the collaboration and support between the parties at design, construction, and occupation stage. And I think the quicker we can get to that status, the quicker we can get to a point where actually construction, what we design, what we deliver, is going to get a reputation back that actually it's fit for use, it's fit for purpose, and we're not out there just to kind of cut our losses and run and try and grab the turnover and nothing else. I think it will come about at a point in time, but at the moment, whilst fire certificates are out there, fire inspections are out there, there's nothing really that kind of gives me the confidence of knowing that through the stages of an ER, to development of scope, to the release of the design, to the delivery of the construction, there's not actually a phase certification that's no different to BREEAM or EPC ratings that we're used to seeing now. So in my mind, I think that's something that we need to consider, but we can only out here to share an opinion and obviously not change the way that things are done. But I do think that working with a few, it will help us get the kind of product far better than it's been in the past. Which is why I kind of agreed that to work with Salus and SGP on this would be a good thing to do, and certainly to represent Stepnell in this region with the type of work that we get involved in. So thank you for listening.
Huge thanks to all of our speakers today for those not just interesting but also incredibly important insights as well into the regulations that have come into place post the Grenfell tragedy. Now, it's a delight now to be joined by all of the people that you've just heard from. So we're joined by Darren, we're joined by Kanti, and we are joined by Paul. Thank you all of you for joining us. Also, thank you to everyone who's already put some questions into the Q&A. That's fantastic. We have got these three gentlemen for about 25 minutes or so, so do keep your questions coming in if there's anything that comes to mind as we're speaking with them. But let's get stuck into it, shall we? Paul, this first question is for you. Do you feel that this process of guidance and exemptions is going to continue to be as fluid as it has been, or are we nearing a more of a settling point now?
I think we're far nearer to a settling point now that the government's set on that road towards a defined route of this golden thread that's been mentioned several times as part of the presentations, is removing some of the vagueness. We've now concentrated on buildings within scope to set out specific expectations of combustibility materials. And I think now that the government has recognised that there was significant need to change those, then there will be a settling down period. Part B is going to be reviewed on several more occasions, because there's going to be further parts to it that will include more than just the external envelope. It will look at other factors such as the means of escape within the building and the effects that sprinklers have brought about. And also something that was very topical at the time was also about the fact that a stay put policy as well, whether that's appropriate. So there's lots of things that will be part of the consultation process moving forward.
Do you think there'll ever be a time where it's completely set and settled, or is that something that, I suppose it can't be, can it? Because it does need to always be fluid and changing.
Well, building regulations have historically changed around about every 3 years, and we have more than just fire safety within building regulations. But the idea was to give a period of stability so that buildings could be procured and constructed. And that was the idea of having this time scale. Part L, for example, with regards to conservation of fuel and power, has been on a journey to continually improve the performance of it. So this period of settling down, I think, will take a good while yet before we get to staying static, really, because the buildings are going to continue to evolve, as does construction.
Yes, naturally, of course. Now, Darren, this next one is for you. How prevalent is the combative JFDI attitude on site? Is the main source of that pressure from the client side?
I wouldn't necessarily say it's just client side, but I mean, I've worked for two. I'm not going to name names, but I've worked for two kind of big tier one contractors, and there is at times very much. I suppose it's coming in equal measure from a client's demanding side, particularly when you look at some of the residential stuff we are doing, or we have done in the past. But then naturally, you've got tier ones and those with let's say a bigger clout in the market that will actually put an awful lot of pressure on subbies and suppliers around to just get on and do the job, because there's an end date, there's an end result, and let's face it, everybody's in it to get a product done for a certain price, and that, for me, that's got to get to a point where it stops. The time spent doing some of these things is going to be far more beneficial when nobody wants to go back to what we've seen in the presentation and what happened in 2017. So I'm just using some real experiences there of saying, look, if this happens, if anybody disagrees, I think you're in an ideal place. If you've never seen that before, then it's great. But I think primarily it's still coming from client, but we're getting it, and you do get it from some of the larger contracting organisations, because they've got a project to deliver for a certain time.
Yes, of course. Everyone's got those deadlines, I suppose, haven't they? Now, Kanti, as architects, do you feel pressure from clients to constantly be thinking one step ahead when it comes to these regulations, given how fluid we've just mentioned that they are?
Well, it is so fluid, and things are still to settle down. To some extent, it does. I think there'll be a fallback to the regulations and the more strict interpretation of the existing regulations and the emerging ones, of course. So I think that will probably dissuade against some fire engineered solutions, for example, and there might be restrictions brought about by that. From the client relationship point of view, yes, we've still got to provide a professional service to the client, and we will always, as architects, try and do that in the most informed and knowledgeable way, in the interests of the clients and the building and the architecture, of course. as a response.
Yes, definitely. Now, Paul, we've got a bit of a technical question for you. So when you use MVHR and have plastic inlet ducts and discharge ducts going through the external wall, do you need to fire stop them externally within the cladding?
Well, ultimately, the answer is yes. To be clear, the use of the word plastic there, that's one of the inaccuracies. The duct itself would have to be a material limited stability, and that's been all part of this road towards removing some of the areas and what specifically is an exempt part of the construction. But realistically, buildings have to be treated so that they pass the services from the internal to the external without entering the cavity voids, really. So they need to be fire stopped, but also they need to perform the provisions in relation to air tightness, which is not necessarily a fire safety issue, but it's part of the way in which the building actually performs.
Very good, thank you. Now, Darren, you mentioned upskilling and the importance of understanding each other's trades a little bit better, particularly moving forward. So how challenging has that aspect been during, dare we say it, COVID-19?
It is challenging. It is challenging, but I think with everything, as long as everyone's got the right professional kind of approach and measures in place to dealing with COVID, there's still no reason why any of us can't go about doing our jobs in the normal way. And from my perspective, and I think we've all mentioned it, it's about awareness, it's communication, and just having that bit of time to just understand what another role is and what that involves, and whether that's from 2 meters or through VC, it can still be done. So I don't see that being the blocker to what we've got to get through.
And to be fair, that links in quite nicely to something you were saying earlier on. Both Canty and Darren, you mentioned this in your presentations, that there's this collective responsibility moving forwards to ensure that tragedies like Grenfell don't happen again. So Canty, I'll come to you first, and Darren and Paul, by all means, feel free to jump in after him. But what would you recommend is the best and most immediate way to achieve this sense of collaboration and make sure it's a success?
Well, obviously the experience helps, and I think Darren mentioned the possibility of if you know the personnel and the teams you're working with, that's a positive thing. There's always going to be things to learn and understand from each other, and I think the procurement process, I think, will be the main item of criticism in as a consequence of the Grenfell inquiry. Actually, I think that has brought a focus on procurement methods and how they are actioned from design through to completion. So I think a review of that and the relationship that's necessary between all the parties in that procurement process is the area to focus on, and that must come through extra communications, extra dialogues, and early understanding of subcontractor design, for example, at an earlier stage as well, so that there are no questions unanswered or aspects not considered. The other factor being, of course, is, and again, Darren's covered it to some extent, is the attention to detail on site and control of quality control on site. So that again is a collective thing, I think, as a responsibility. And there's a part of me, that's old school and remembers the days of the old clerk of the works. And I can see that role almost coming back again to some extent, in some form, some client representative in the form of a clerk of works who is monitoring and looking at, perhaps this building safety regulator by default will cover that. But I can see a process of change between the way we deliver buildings in a way post-Grenfell.
Darren, would you like to add anything onto that? Because I know you did mention it in your presentation.
I'm kind of nodding as Canty's talking, because it was only yesterday we spoke about Clerk of Works potentially coming back into some of these things. But I mean, again, for me, it just comes back to that piece around there's a group ethos around some of this delivery as it stands. There's loads of consultants, there's regulatory bodies out there, there's the main contractors. if everyone's got an awareness around what needs to be delivered, we're constantly in dialogue with the clients and end users. You know, clerk of works is one role, but I think if everybody's kind of got that shared approach to it, there's more than a set of eyes out there that can actually manage this and deal with it. But we've got to be open about it. And you know, one of the examples we're dealing with at the minute, we've only just found out that on one job we're tendering, a consultant hasn't got PI for the relevant designs on a facade, but we've had to ask. We've not been told. So it's little things like that where I just think it should be two-way. There should be an openness about it, so that it's not a shame to say we haven't got PI for that area of specialism, but can we deal with it? If we hadn't have asked, that would have slipped through the net, and then the liabilities clearly and squarely with us as contractors to deal with it. And that for me is where this golden thread piece has got to start to come together.
Yeah, I mean, that is a prime example, actually, isn't it? So thank you for that. Now, Paul, we're going to come to you for this one. Who is responsible for repairing the buildings and for bearing the cost when it's found an existing building can't receive the fire officer sign-off following a building inspection, be that for issues similar to Grenfell or other faults?
Well, it's been quite put into the public domain that ultimately it's the building owners who are responsible for it. Having said that, the government did recognise that put burden on people who bought properties in multiple developments, and they've recognised that in that case, that because of the financial constraints, that they've supported it with additional funding as well, so that there is the ability to at least apply for ensuring that the most important aspect is that the building is made safe, and then revisit the aspect of how it's ultimately corrected from a funding point of view.
It's almost like you saw our next question then, because our next question was, is there any funding available for any of these necessary changes? So yes, I suppose the answer is. Now, Kanti, next question is for you. Is there a taboo about cladding in particular from clients generally, or do you get the impression that they have faith in the architects and the specifiers?
I think the the driver on that one is coming more from insurance companies, where yes, a building can go up, but it then has to be insured, doesn't it, for its life? And there is a reaction, some might say an overreaction, in terms of what is acceptable. And we've seen that also in terms of limitations being placed on some consultants by PI insurers as well. So they're actually excluding the PI cover for certain buildings which has certain claddings, for example. You know, so there's pressure coming from all sorts of directions on this particular aspects. At the same time, manufacturers and product designers and things are also working very hard to come up with solutions which counter some of the deficiencies that perhaps have been spotlighted now. And so there's opportunity there as well in terms of newer products and newer construction ways of doing things there. Yeah, I think I mentioned in my talk about the owners' insurance brokers, and they might place certain demands on things, which then immediately places limitations on the designer. So it's important to get that information early on to avoid sort of abortive works or exploring things that are absolutely unnecessary.
I suppose it comes down to that collaborative approach again, doesn't it? Collaborative is definitely going to be the buzzword from today's webinar. So many great questions coming in, by the way. Thank you ever so much for getting involved. We've still got time for a few more, so if anything comes to your mind, do please feel free to type them into the Q&A box. Darren, this one is for you. So you mentioned the resource challenges on site, but what is the solution? It's quite a hard question, I'm sure, but what is the solution? Is it better planning at pre-con, or is it down to a more collaborative approach as we've been talking about today?
To be honest, I think it's a bit of both. You know, we've got to be open and honest with ourselves, and you know, certainly in Stepnell we are. When we're doing pre-con and planning, the resource levels are put into jobs that we feel are, you know, right for the type of project we're dealing with. But then equally, when you're dealing with the subcontract supply chain and even the consultant, there'll be certain challenges that we don't always see at that point in time that will come up, with immediate effect. And it's at that point then where I think collaboration and, talking to the likes of SGP and Canty or others, or even Salus, we need an extra level of eyes or input just to get us over a solution or find a way forward. And I think that is then ultimately where we need to be. But resources are a challenge for everybody now, isn't it? It's, we're all in an industry which is constantly under pressure. But I think the thing is, go in aware, eyes open, and see what we can do to pave the right path.
Absolutely. Now, Paul, we're getting quite a lot of technical questions coming through, so we may need to answer these later, but it may be that you can answer it now, but we'll give it a go. So if we assume that all products and components used to erect external walls are A1 or A2 rated products, can you assume that no further certification of the systems required, as you can't set the wall on fire by default?
Well, on that basis of those assumptions, and that is correct, what is important to remember is that the materials actually used do meet that criteria. So if the assumption in itself has to be proven by the fact that products that are selected and built into the various parts of the components of the external wall construction actually do achieve that criteria and actually have the appropriate fire test to meet that A1 or A2 S2D0 criteria.
I should never have doubted you. You knew the answer to that straight away. I shouldn't have doubted you at all, Paul. Thank you. Now, we've got time for one final question, which I'd like to put to all three of you, please, before we then hand back to Umesh. Do you think that there are any glaring omissions from these proposed changes to regulations, or do you think they've hit the nail on the head, would you say? I'll come to you first, Darren.
I wouldn't say glaring omissions. I think I'd go back to the final piece that I'd referred to in my slides, which is this kind of phase certification. I think if we could get to a point where at an ER stage to a pre-con stage to a design compliance and then construction and handover, if we've got a coded status that at each one of those processes, we're able to demonstrate and hand over a compliant design or a compliant build or a compliant set of ERs, I think confidence is going to very quickly be restored in the fact that, and it's been mentioned already, it was assumed everyone would work to the regs, and it's assumed that everyone does what they need to do. But I think if we've got that piece of paper in front of us that gives us the ERs are compliant, the design is compliant, this is compliant, then that thread is very much there.
Absolutely. Kanzi?
Yeah, I think the new system is set up, as Darren says, for that compliance check all along the way, and I think that's a positive thing. In the past, the regulations, let's face it, have been open to interpretation, and in certain areas, and maybe fire is the primary one, that should be more regulatory. And if it means certification, and if it means proving certain materials or having things fire tested and things, then that has to be. We can't afford another tragedy like that, can we? So it's we're going to have to work harder at it and work together on it and meet those emerging requirements.
Of course, absolutely. Collaboration all the way. And Paul, any final words from you? Anything you think might have been missed out potentially?
Well, I would just embrace the words that Darren and Canty have said there, really. I think the government has recognised they did need to react pretty swiftly. They needed to tighten up the guidance, as Canty mentioned there before, regarding the use of the word interpretation, by effectively incorporating far more prescriptive, defined guidance so that it sets out in a very clearer path. Then I think we're on a far better journey to ensure that buildings are far safer, and it builds confidence for construction in the UK. Absolutely.
And that is the most important thing, absolutely. Now, thank you to all three of you for answering all of those questions. We're out of time to answer any more questions, I'm afraid. So if there are any that we've not answered, I'm sure we'll be able to get those to our speakers and hopefully be able to get them out onto ProCon's social channels or in some other way for you to be able to get the answers to your questions. Thank you for asking. There were some really good questions there. But for now, I'll hand back over to Umesh, who is going to bring today's webinar to a close.
Thanks, Danielle. That brings us to the end of today's webinar. I want to say a big thank you to our fantastic speakers, Paul, Canty and Darren. and to everyone involved in the organisation of this webinar today, and of course all of you for watching. Remember, you can get in touch with us if you're interested in becoming a ProCon member by emailing us at info@procon-nottinghamshire.co.uk or info@procon-leicestershire.co.uk, or by giving us a call on 07803 126 807. We'll be back soon with our next webinar, so do keep an eye out on our social media channels and newsletters for information about what's coming up next and how to save yourself a place. But for now, thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.